Hey everybody, Troy here and welcome to video 12 of our PowerShell Fundamentals series. This one's called PowerShell Variables Part 2. In our last video, we did an introductory look at PowerShell variables. We were looking at a very simple way of creating some very simple variables, and then we were putting and combining those variables into some very basic PowerShell scripts. And we were seeing how we can actually create that interaction to enhance the scripts we're building in our PowerShell world. We're quickly going to find, though, that there's more to variables than meet the eye. And in this video, what I want to do is take a quick look at some of the things that are happening under the hood so we can better prepare ourselves for when a variable doesn't do what we expect it to do. And we're going to do that by taking a quick look at the official commandlets associated with variables. We were cheating a little bit in our last video by using that $sign construction of variables. It's a very feasible, very functional way to work, but there are some very official PowerShell commandlets associated with variables. We'll take a look at those. We're also going to take a look at how PowerShell is handling variable objects. It's classifying everything as a specific data type, because remember, in PowerShell everything is in fact an object. So PowerShell is making some decisions under the hood about how it handles the contents of your variable, and we want to make sure that we understand that data type, what PowerShell is doing, and when necessary we declare variables in our own data type when it suits our purpose. We're also going to take a look at a comparison between working with both single and multiple object variables. So some variables contain one single item, so one object, and other variables can contain multiple objects, a complete collection of objects, if you will. And we're going to take a look at some of the tools we've got to play with that. All right, let's get at it. I'm going to start off by opening up our PowerShell ISE. Okay, now where we left off is we were doing some tiny scripting there. And I'm going to just tuck the scripting pane away. I'm going to go back to just playing with some variables here. And interestingly enough, we saw how easy it was to create a variable and assign it some contents. So $A equals 5. We created a variable called A. The contents of A is the integer 5. Done. We find we can just call that variable. Excellent, no problem. And there's a lot of things we can do with this, but before we start making that our go-to, we should take a look at the official commands associated with, let's do a get command here, where the noun is the word variable. And so we got, there we go. We got 5 specific commandlets here. Clear variable, get variable, new variable, remove, and set. So they do just what they sound like they do. New variable is another way of playing with this. Get variable, that retrieves, that's calling it. Clear variable does exactly what you'd assume. It clears the contents of that variable. Remove and set. All of these have a very specific purpose. Usually you see these in the script though. So while they're here, they're there for you to use. I do find that at times they can be a bit more confusing. So for example, let's just give you an example. I'm going to build a variable called A, and I'm going to put the contents of that variable to be the string hello. Again, this is what we did last video. You see, that's pretty straightforward. But I also could have done this. I could have gone new variable, and I have an opportunity to create the name. Here's a very common set of confusion, a very common issue here. So many people do this. They go, okay, A, the value of that is going to be, let's make that the string goodbye. Okay, now let's look a really very careful look at this, because this could be confusing. What I'm doing is I already have, remember, I already have a variable called hello, I have a variable called A, and the contents of that variable is the word hello. Now in this second line, what I'm doing is now I'm actually creating another variable. But look very carefully. What do you think is going to happen when I type in the name? I call the name $A and assign it the value of goodbye. Well, let's take a look. Okay, so if I type in $A, well, it's still hello. Why is that? Because, Troy, I thought we were making a new variable with the value of goodbye. Well, no, we weren't. In this case, what we ended up doing, because if you're not careful with that $, that denotes the contents of the variable called A. So what I ended up doing there, just so we're 100% clear, is I created a variable called hello. Okay, sorry, stop that. I created a variable called A, and I gave it the contents of the contents called hello. Here I said take the contents of the variable called A, which is the word hello, and make that the name of a new variable with the value of that variable being goodbye. So what I've actually done here is I've created accidentally a variable called hello that has the contents of goodbye. So it's really subtle, but it's important that you understand what happened there, because if you tried crossing these different types of construction, it can get very, very confusing. If I use the new variable command, I do not need that delineator at all. So what this is going to do is it's going to give me a new variable called, let's create a new variable called C. Okay, and now if I call C, you'll see that it is goodbye. The difference was here, I was actually pulling the contents of another variable, and I was making that the name of the variable I was creating. So it can get really kind of crazy, confusing. So my advice, stick with one or the other way. You're gonna find me using the $ approach because it is simply the fastest and easiest way to go. Plus, I can do all sorts of cool things with it when I start applying methods and functions to these variables, which we're going to do in a short little bit in this video. Now, that's one thing that's happening there. So we saw that little bit of confusing thing, and I wanted to make sure you're set. Let's play with some variables a bit. Let's see how they work. Now, if I created a variable called A, and I'm going to give it a value of 5, and I'm going to create another variable called B, and I'm going to give it a variable of 2. Now, look at very, very important. Look at the difference there. So what I've done here is I have created one variable called A, the contents of which is a 5. Notice there's no quotes there. That is an integer. PowerShell has accepted it as an integer, and because the absence of quotations, it thinks quite accurately I mean it as an integer. The difference between A and B is that I put the 2 in parentheses, or sorry, in quotes, single quotes. So B is a different, although it's still a character, a digit, those quotes denote a string. Now, what that means is if I can take a look here and I can pipe both of these to our friend get member, which of course is the command that we use to take a look at the properties, you can see that A is an integer. It's a system.int32 variable, which is associated with a very specific set of methods. Look, there are no properties. The only thing I can do to an integer is add methods to it. There are no properties of an integer. But what if I pipe B into get member? You see, look, now it is a string. So B is a string, A is an integer. And that becomes really important because of things like this. Remember that A is an integer, and B, let's see if I can add these together. A plus B. I'm going to add an integer to a string, and it goes 7. Okay. So what happened there? Awesome. I know we're dealing with a string. A was 5, B is 2, A plus 2, or 5 plus 2 is 7. Great. What if I try it the other way around though? I'm going to go B plus A. Okay. Ooh, 25. That's different. All right, so you're seeing the behavior of the data type. So I remember that A was an integer. So as soon as I call A, PowerShell assumes that everything that carries on in this construction is going to be able to work with an integer. Now, fortunately, PowerShell was intuitive enough to say B is a digit that can represent an integer. Awesome. I can add 5 plus 2. I'll make it work. He gave me some latitude. When I did the same thing with leading off with B, though, when I started off with B, B is a string, right? And so that means that PowerShell is expecting a whole different set of circumstances to go on here. And so instead of adding the two integers together, it concatenated. So I add integers. So PowerShell will add integers, but what it will do, it will concatenate strings. So it took the 2 and concatenated it with 5 and gave us 25. So it's really important we understand the data type because we're going to get a different result depending on what we do. And now, well, there's a couple other ways we could do this. Now, I understand that each one is a particular data type. Well, I could override this. I could actually ask PowerShell to interpret it a certain way. Now, I know that A is an integer, B is a string. Well, what if I just asked it to do this again? So what I'm going to do here is, instead of letting PowerShell do with what it wants, I'm going to say, I'd like you to treat this particular integer B or variable B as an integer. Let's see what happens there. And now what I did is I declared the value of variable B as an integer, which ended up giving me a completely different result. So now you're seeing is that I have the ways of controlling the type of data that is inside a variable. And this is important to know because every type of variable is a little bit different. So for example, if we have already seen that if I go A as 10, I can guarantee that PowerShell is going to see that as an integer. Okay, and there's actually a cool little thing that I can do here. If I go $A and hover over, it tells me that it's an integer. So a quick little shortcut tells me what I'm dealing with. If I went to B, let's go BA now, and let's make it a 35 with my quotes, and I call A, now it's reading it as a string. I have different ways of manipulating this, and this becomes really important because things like this can happen. If I said my variable of, let's say I wanted to pick a number, so I'm going to go number. That's what I want. But I'm going to use my read host command to have my user give me a number. And I want to say, please choose a number. Okay, cool, no problem. And so I'll do this. The user chooses a number 7, and I'm going to click on number, and look at that. Hang on, let's see if I can get it here. Let's pipe this to GM. Oh, it's a string. Okay, so when the user typed in the number, even though you and I see it's a digit, we ask for a number. Everybody sees it's a number. PowerShell says nope. When you return the input from read host, I'm going to choose it as a string. So it's the same as if I typed in quote around 7, double quotes or single quotes. Okay, so that means that if I'm accepting user information, well, I'm going to have to change that when I get to the word number. Well, I can fix that pretty easily because I could actually say, hey, you know what? I'm going to call it right away. I'm going to say this particular integer, or this particular variable has to be an integer, please. So if I said choose a number, 7, PowerShell goes, cool, I can accept that. We declared the variable that we want for number, we gave it a specific type, but what if I did this again? I'm going to run it one more time, and now I'm going to have the user type in, I don't know, chocolate. Okay, it goes, nope, I can't accept that. I was asked to make sure that the type of data is an integer. I cannot allow you to type in a string. I'm going to stop right there because that's where the error occurred. So it's really important that we're seeing that. So the takeaway here so far is that every time we declare a variable, it will contain a certain data type by default. Many times we're fine with that. Other times we have to override that. And it's very easy to override it. We just select the type of variable that we want ahead of the variable. We have different types of variables. We have ints, so we have integers, we have strings, we have things like char, so we can actually declare it a certain number of characters. So maybe we're expecting a phone number or a postal code or something. Well, we can define the number of characters that we would expect that variable to have. We have things like booleans, which are a true or a false. We have floats, which accept decimal numbers and fractional numbers. We have singles and doubles and there's a whole bunch of them. And we can actually figure out as we go whatever we need. There's very likely a variable data type that will let us play with that. So as we start exploring with variables, you're going to start exploring the ways we can declare their data type, either to address and adjust what PowerShell is doing with it automatically, or to get ahead of PowerShell and say right out of the gate, this is what I want, as in that read host example that always returns a string. Okay, now we know that we can do some fairly basic math. As you saw me, I was adding things together. If I'm going to add, I'm going to go 5 and a B equals a 2. I can add them. Okay, so $a or $a plus $a is 5 plus 2 is 7. I can divide them, right? I can do this. Now this will give me a fractional number, so it's doing this all by default. And I could do also, I could multiply them. So all my typical mathematical operations come into play here. So addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, all of this works. No problem there. Let's look at different types of objects inside a variable, whether they're singular or plural. Okay, so the other thing that we want to do is we want to understand that if I type in everything I've been playing with so far has been one single object. So maybe it's going to be a string called, I'm going to go PC01. Okay, so actually let's do this. I'm going to call it not that name, I'm going to call it computer name. All right, so whoopsie, I can't put a single quote with a double quote. PowerShell does not like that. It says choose whatever you want, Troy, but you got to have one or the other. I'm going to go with single quotes. So I've created a variable called computer name, and I've called it PC01. If I call the computer name, it says, yeah, it's PC01. I can add multiple objects inside my variable simply by putting a comma in here. So I can go PC02 and PC, oopsie, single quotes again, single quote, comma, single quote PC03, single quote, and let's go PC04. Uh-oh, see, I forgot my single quotes. So that color coding syntax is huge. There we go. I've just separated 4 objects by a comma, and PowerShell has accepted it. Now, if I ask for the contents of this variable, I've got 4 things, and PowerShell says, awesome, you have 4 things. What type of data type are they? Well, let's take a look. Let's pipe it to jet member. They are strings. Okay, so that means they're not doing anything with it. But so many of my PowerShell parameters accept strings, that's perfectly fine. If I wanted to use one of these as a computer name in one of my PowerShell scripts, the string is very likely going to work because that's the type of argument that goes with the computer name or the computer parameter. But how do I pick the one I want? Well, this is where my methods come in. Okay, so now I've got a variable called computer name, but if I use the dot, I can chain different members to this, and those members are both properties and they are also methods. And so again, I could ask for the count. There's 4 items in my box. This computer name box has 4 items. I can ask for other types of properties, right? Let's ask for the length. Okay, see what I got? Well, there's 4. Okay, there's 4 items. Every item is a count. Interestingly enough, though, what if I want to deal with one of the objects? Okay, so let's go PC. I know that when I pull this out, I got PC01, and let's ask for one of these. Well, when I typed this in, PowerShell was equating a number, an index, to each of these. Every single item in my collection is indexed, and it's just numerical, 0, 1, 2, 3. So I have the first item is 0, the second is 1, the third is 2, and the fourth is 3. Okay, so if I wanted to pull the first item, well, I can actually just have PowerShell do that by using my sharp brackets around the variable. So what I've said here is I've said, PowerShell, please find the first object in the variable computer name, which happens to be PC01. Awesome. I could do the same thing if I wanted to find the 4th item, which is number 3 on the index. There we go. Will PowerShell respond something if there's not in the index? Nope. There is no 6th item in the computer's index. So it's not going to give me anything back there. But I can now also chain to a specific item in here. Okay, so that means the computer name that is, let's go computer name that's 0. And you'll see that I have all my properties, etc. here with this. Okay, so I could actually find the length of item 1 in my collection of items inside that variable. Now, where does that become handy? Well, what if we wanted to do this, do something larger with this? Let's get instead of me just having a list of items, well, I could actually let's go to service. Okay, I'm going to create a variable called services, and I'm going to marry that to get service. That's what I'm going to do. And now I've got a massive collection of items. Well, I wonder how many are there in there. Well, let's count them. Okay, I can chain that to one of the methods because, again, if I take a look at what this is, I can do GM. Okay, well, these are service processes now. So this is a special data type. These are the methods, and one of those methods is going to allow me to actually figure out how many they are. Let's count them. Okay, services dot count. Now remember, I'm not dealing with a specific item in here. There's no count. There's no count. So where is this count coming from? Well, what it's doing is I'm dealing with the collection. So this is a tool that lets me deal with the collection specific. Get members telling me the specific properties of a specific item on that list. Let's try to retrieve the first item. I'm going to go, hard bracket 0 and 1. The first item is my Adobe ARM service. Okay, well, let's find the name of that. Well, the name of the first item in my collection inside the variable called services is Adobe ARM services. Now, Adobe ARM services has a series of properties associated with it, and I can play with that because those properties became apparent the moment I selected one of them. Can the Adobe services, can I stop that? I don't know. True, I can. So again, subtle but important difference. When I'm dealing with a single object variable, the methods associated, the members associated with those variables are readily apparent. When I'm dealing with a collection, if I'm dealing with the variable as a whole, I have a very specific set of tools to deal with the complete collection. I have to specify, however, one of the objects in there to really get at the members associated with that type of object. So hopefully you're seeing some of the things I can do with this, because often what I won't do is deal with the collection like this. Maybe what I want to do is pull something like this out. Okay, so I'm going to do let's do a quick little look at services. Okay, there's a whole bunch of services in here. Okay, and now I'm going to actually say, I'm just going to arbitrarily take, let's take the first one. Again, I'm not going to get too fancy here. I'm going to select the first service out of the list. So I'm going to go services, and I want that one to be the first one on the list. I want to return that, no problem. Let's put that into a variable. Okay, well, I'm going to create another variable called selected service. Okay, so I'm going to create a variable called selected service. I'm going to choose a service from the box that is my services variable, and I'm going to make that variable to be, let's say I want to go services, and then I'm going to do that, 0. Awesome. Better yet, let's get the name of that. Awesome. Let's see how this works. Okay, let's see what happens when I type in selected service. It worked, right? Yes, it did. So you can see that what I did is I took the first item, I took one property of the first item in the collection that lives inside the services variable, and I was able to now place that into another specific variable called selected service. So hopefully you can see that I can use variables to narrow down and define, because now this selected service has something I can work with, and I can use that in a script that makes that a bit more specific. Now sometimes PowerShell will give me a bit of grief here, because if you're not careful, you could end up, you often sometimes need a substring here, but you'll get an error if you don't, but I won't even get into that. Let's just keep that simple here. So what you've now seen is that I have a variety of different data types associated with these things. Let's actually just wrap it up here. So what I wanted you to take away with here is that there are specific commandlets associated with PowerShell. They're very handy. But in order to use them, you've got to adopt that syntax. And you don't want to blend the two paths. A common mistake is, as you saw in the video, using that $sign, because that's a separate method of doing that. My personal approach is to stick with the $sign, because I'm also chaining methods to these particular variables all the time, and that $sign approach lets me do that. Okay, we also saw that PowerShell is automatically putting data types associated with variables. They're very specific, they're unique, it's making decisions for us. If, however, we disagree with the decisions or we're not able to work with those decisions, we can change the data type by declaring the variable in a certain way. And we do that by preceding that $sign segment, that $sign segment syntax with a sharp brackets, hard brackets, with whatever data type we want. Int, char, boolean, string, whatever we want, we can do that. Now, we also saw that PowerShell, when we're working with a single object variable, we can deal with the properties associated with that variable. It's fairly easy to work with. But PowerShell lets us have multiple objects inside the variable. We can put an entire collection or an array inside a variable. Now that adds a level of complexity, because if I chain this to, if I create a variable that is a collection of objects, I have to do some specific things to retrieve the object that I want. And that gets into that particular chaining that you saw. I can pull out, I can deal with the objects as a whole, or I can select an object and deal with it individually by, again, using those sharp brackets, those hard brackets at the end of the variable that I choose. And so hopefully now you've seen that there's a whole subset of syntax associated with these variables, and they're going to come up in various times. Right out of the gate, I can't tell you where you're going to see them next until you start trying to apply these into scripts. The way to play with these is to put them into the scripts and then see how these scripts operate. See what's happening, how PowerShell is dealing with the data in that script pipeline, and then make the accommodation and adjustments as you go. The only way to learn how to do this is to start playing, and that's the next step for you. Get in, start playing with some of these variables in your scripts, and you will start seeing the way you need to manipulate them to suit what you're after. Hopefully that helped. We're going to move on to the next video. I will see you then.